Hello, I'm Tanya.
And I'm Tammy, and we are the hosts of the Child Psych podcast. We're moms, we're psychologists, we're play therapists, and this is one of our favorite jobs in the world is to speak to all of you about so many topics and bring you hopefully amazing interviews. And today we are going to be talking about grief. The holidays are coming up. It's complex. It's supposed to be happy. It's not always happy. And today we're going to get real about that and how hard it can be for people, whether it's Thanksgiving or Christmas or whatever holiday you're celebrating.
Tim, it's really interesting. I think so often when it comes to holidays and, with the Christmas holiday upcoming, there's always this feeling of like, this is about warmth and joy and connection. And then people go, but why do you want to talk about grief? Here's the reality though. Just prior to this podcast, I was looking up some research on grief and loss, and I came across this really interesting study. And it showed that in 2021, and we know that 2021 was a rough year across the planet for everybody,
Yes.
but in 2021, they did a study in the United States with 2,000 adults. And what they found was that 35% of the adults in that study said that they did not want to celebrate the holidays because of grief. So I
Wow.
feel like that's a third. I feel like grief is lurking under the surface, but nobody really talks about it. Particularly, I think as a culture, we're horrible about talking about grief, but particularly around holidays, it just gets stuffed down and crammed down, and no one actually goes, what is actually happening here? A third.
Yeah, I know for me, losing a parent a few years ago and then having a blended family where I don't ever have Christmas Eve with the kids. We only have Christmas Day. Like Christmas Eve is difficult. And I think for parents who have lost their parents, and my grandparents, even thinking about them, like that was such a big part of Christmas for me. When there's a loss of a relationship, I remember the first Christmas of my separation. Like, you want to be happy for your kids, you really do, but part of you is just miserable inside, just hoping like for it to end.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, there's this kind of this awkwardness often with holidays. I know the first Christmas after I lost my brother, there was this kind of, do we talk about it? Do we not? How do we actually bring him into this Christmas with us? How's mom? How's dad? Do we want to go there or do we not want to go there? So I think there's just so many intricacies involved. And we also know that when there's stress and there's holidays, this is a time that might highlight cracks within families that are still together. So you might have a brother and a sister who have lost a parent, and there might be a crack, and then it's like, okay, so what do we do around the holiday? And if there's going to be a time when tension comes up, it's highly likely that we're going to be feeling it at that time too.
What do you think we should be, if we know someone who's going through this, what do you think we can do to help them with that? Like, we feel awkward, it's supposed to be happy, but at the same time, we know maybe someone who has lost a parent or who is just going through a divorce or they've lost something like a child. Like, there's so many different kinds of grief that people can be going through. Maybe they've even lost a job and their Christmas isn't what they would hoped it would be. How do we bring that up with them? Like, what do you think? I mean, grief is more your
Mm-hmm.
area.
Yeah, so I think there's two areas that I would love to look at. And I love this. How do we actually help a grieving person? I love too that you mentioned different types of grief because I think sometimes parents, people like a loss of a job, a loss of a pet, a miscarriage. Sometimes I feel like as if people don't feel like they have the room to actually speak about their grief in the same way when it's as obvious as a loss, for example. So yeah, let's talk about how we can help people, and then let's talk about how we can help ourselves. So I think the first thing, if we know somebody who's been through a loss, is to really stop and ask yourself, before you ask them, ask yourself, what does this person need right now? What do I think they need right now? And if it's helpful, you can write a list. Is it me dropping off a meal? Is it helping to put up the Christmas tree this year? What do they need? And then when you actually do see that person, really checking in. And again, I'm going to come back to this and say that as a culture, we're very uncomfortable around grief and loss. And so very often we're trying to get over our own uncomfortable feelings with it. And so very quickly we do this check-in and say like, hey, I just want to check how you are with doing, how you doing this year, or how are you? But we ask it in a way that doesn't actually always give room for the person to talk about how they're doing. So just to be really intentional, even if you're nervous, even if your voice quivers, to go up to the person and say, I just wanted to check in. How are you? how are things going? If you know the person well, you can tell the story. You know, if you're putting up the tree with them, you can tell a story that you remember about their dad or about their mom. Be really careful not to kind of lean into little sayings that we all do, like I'm thinking of you, or I know how you feel. Nobody knows how anybody else feels in a situation like this. The other one that I really like to stay away from, and people feel differently about this, is when we say, let me know what you need, because it puts the emphasis and the responsibility back on the other person. And it almost makes us feel better. Okay, I've done something, when really we've done that. When really we've done nothing. So I would say, instead say, I'm going to drop off a casserole, or I'm going to do some Christmas baking for you this year, and I'm going to drop that off so you don't even have to worry about it.
I know when I've had, and the last couple years have been like, I'm emotional even talking about this. Like, here we are doing this podcast on grief, and my grief is coming up during this podcast. And it was so nice when people simply sent me a text message and acknowledged that it was hard. Like, they don't know exactly what I'm going through, but they said, I imagine that this time of year is really hard. Please know I'm thinking about you. Like, just acknowledging it is just so nice, because you feel visible, you feel seen, and people aren't expecting you to show up in any certain way. It's just acknowledging that there's parts of this that are hard, and that just feels, yeah, if you feel visible.
I love that. Yeah. And Tam, I think that's a huge one. I think whether it's a text or whether it's a note, you know, some of us might be uncomfortable, whether it's a note just saying, hey, I'm thinking of you.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a
And
big, sorry.
go ahead.
Yeah. I think another one is, that can be really helpful, is to acknowledge those important dates. So, you know, if we're getting into the season and there's dates that need to be acknowledged, putting it in your calendar and remembering, oh yes, today would have been her mom's birthday, today was her dad's birthday, or this is the year of the loss, or this is the date of the loss. Remembering those dates and actually acknowledging it, because I find we're often very good in the 2 to 3 weeks following the loss of somebody, and then everybody just continues on with life as we do. But it's those anniversaries that can be so hard, and often I think the greatest support is not necessarily needed in those 2 weeks after a loss, because that's when everybody else is there. It's 2 months after the loss or 3 months after the loss.
Absolutely. And I know, as you know, being a parent, and you're a parent, and we've gone through grief and we've gone through loss, and holidays for me in particular can be very hard. One thing that comes up for me as a parent is you have this really complex feelings around the holidays, right? And you so badly want Christmas, especially in my family, is probably the biggest holiday of the year. And you want that to be magical for your kids. And sometimes we're just sold that, and sometimes it just comes from a very legitimate place where we have these really fond memories. But I have this distinct memory of 2 years ago. My dad had recorded a book for my son, an audiobook at Christmas. And I read it to my kids, or I play it for my kids, and we read along with the audiobook that he made. And I burst into crying every single year. And then, of course, my kids look at me like, like, what do I do? And making space for that, like, what would you say when parents have these moments when they burst into tears, or like it's just really hard and they're irritable? How do they navigate that with their kids?
Yeah, I think just being open and raw and honest and saying, okay, we're gonna listen to the book that Grandpa made. Did you call him Grandpa?
Yeah, Grandpa Dwayne.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. We're gonna listen to the book that Grandpa Dwayne made for us. Mommy's going to probably get teary. This is always a little bit hard for me, but I want to share this with you. So sometimes naming it up front, if you know it's going to be tender for you, but I think it's good for our children to see us grieve in a healthy way. It can be helpful if there is another adult, if you know that it's hard for you to kind of cry and then regain yourself. Then kids need to see that we can regain ourselves. They go, okay, look at all of these feelings that mom's having. If you're having a hard time going, I can actually catch my breath, or I can stop crying, to have another adult there can be helpful. But I think it's good. I think that when we teach kids it's okay to feel, and to feel deeply, to love. If we miss someone deeply, it means that we've loved deeply. What a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful thing for them to see. I think so often grief is hidden from our children. And then when they hit their own grief moments, they have no idea how to navigate them, because they've never actually seen other people grieve in a healthy way.
Yeah. I know one of the things that was hard for me, and I knew from like working with Sam and you, and we've done all of our own personal work, that when my kids know something's wrong. Like it's, it's Christmas Eve or they're leaving to go to the other parent's house and I'm having all these feelings, and kids know, they know intuitively, they know when their parents are off, like that. They're designed that way. And it takes everything in your power not to say nothing. Don't worry about it. Have a good time. And because that teaches kids that not to trust their gut, not to trust their intuition, and doesn't really bode well for emotional intelligence there. And just being honest, without oversharing that why we are upset. And yeah, we are, like, this is hard, without burdening them. I think that's where we want to, there's an interesting line there between putting too much on them, so they're caretaking, versus just being honest. And that's an interesting line to walk.
100%. 100%. I know with my girls, when they know that moments are going to be difficult. So, for example, when I'm grieving my brother, also at Christmas, or whenever it may be, but Christmas is the big holiday in our family, it can be helpful for them to have something to do. So when they know, oh, this is a way that I can help mommy. So whether it's getting the Kleenex box, whether it's helping daddy make me a cup of tea, or whether it's them drawing a picture for Uncle Greg, having something to do has helped them, instead of going, oh, we don't know what to do with mom right now.
Put that energy somewhere very specific.
Yeah, redirect. I think as we talk about our own grief process here, it's really important to think about how we can also help ourselves during the holiday period. One of the big ones that comes to mind here is boundaries for me. So, I think, again, so often when it comes to holidays, whatever holiday we're celebrating, there's often a lot of emphasis on we need to do lots of different dinners and lots of different gifts and then lots of different cards and whatever it might be. And again, I think it's about sitting down at the start of that holiday season and being proactive instead of reactive. And there is always going to be some reactivity, but as much as possible going, what can I do this year? So can I, if we go back to Christmas, can I do 5 different family dinners? Yes or no? What am I saying no to? What am I saying yes to? Is there a time, if there's a meal that I have to do that I cannot get out of, is there a time that I say that I'm leaving? I will leave by whatever it might be, 8:30 p.m., 9 p.m. So really looking at what can I do, what can I not do, and then figuring out how you're actually going to put those boundaries in place. So I find when I have boundaries that need to be put in place, thinking about the words ahead of time can be really helpful, so that I don't end up justifying or giving a long story, but just saying, this is what I can do.
Yeah, and sometimes there's so much guilt that comes with that. I know, being able to set that, but giving space for that too, that it can be hard. Saying no is hard if you're a people pleaser, or just in general, like, you love your family and you want to make them happy, but it's not going to be manageable, is just having some self-compassion that you're probably not going to be your best self, and it's going to be a lot worse if you try to push through it. And then I'm guessing that's going to take its toll on your relationship with your kids or with your spouse later on, versus the people you probably won't see again for another 6 months.
Totally. And for in my own family, because there's all of the things, right? There's all of the holiday stress, and then we've spoken about our own journeys. I know in my own family, we had to really go, what do we want out of our holiday time together? Do we want to be rushing from place to place? Do we want the girls exhausted with no space to actually go, this is our holiday, or this is what we want our girls to remember? These are our rituals, these are our traditions. And so we've made a very, very intentional decision on what we will and will not attend. I tend to be more of a people pleaser. My husband is not. So he's great at saying, like, we're not coming.
Yeah, I imagine Bernard would be really good about that.
Yeah. So again, but I do want to make space that it can be really hard to say, I'm not able to attend.
Absolutely. And I think too, when we're talking about making space for feelings, the more we resist it, the more it persists. So to me, one of the biggest things I do to cope, and it may sound strange to some of you, I will intentionally have a meltdown before I have to go do something. Like, I will play certain songs that evoke like a lot of emotion, or like bring out ornaments or that are going to evoke that, so I can have a good cry, so I can completely lose it. Like, with my husband there, with no kids around, like, I can just lose it. So later on, maybe it doesn't come out as irritability, as me yelling or something else like that. Just knowing, like, I need to like get that out. And
I love that.
yeah. it's just something
Yeah.
that music's great for me for that. I just find putting music on, then I can just let it
Yeah.
go.
Yeah. And, as we talk about music too, for me, when we talk about grief and music, I find the way that I connect with people that I've lost is through music and songs that I connect with them. And same thing, sometimes I just have to put music on that reminds me of them so that I can have a good cry without feeling as if I have to talk to somebody about what's going on. It's just my own personal experience.
Yeah, I've done
Yeah.
that in the car more times than I can count.
The next one that I think we need to really look at is often within family systems, we may all be grieving the same person. So a grandma, a grandpa, a pet, whatever it might be, is that we really need to make space that people grieve in different ways. So we might have somebody who just says, I just need this healing from the holiday to happen where I can just immerse myself in the holiday experience and cook a turkey and do all of the holiday things. This is my healing. Whereas we might have another sibling who says, I need to really, really back away from everything. We might have somebody else who says, I prefer just to go to a different country for Christmas so that I don't have to deal with all of this here. To really make space that people grieve in different ways. There's no linear format for grief.
Yeah, and part of that, like if we look at like Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's model, like there are stages of grief. I want to be clear, like documented that people go through denial and they go through anger and depression and acceptance and bargaining. Like there's all of these different stages. But what I know I've learned being a psychologist and Tanya's learned, I'm sure she can vouch for that, is that it's not linear.
At
Like
all.
one day you're in anger and the next day you're on the floor crying and then you're like it's fine, like nothing's wrong, or like, and then we're like no, I'm good with it, and we just, and I mean the waves do get smaller. That's the nice thing about grief is they are waves, but one day they're capsizing you and then the next year they might, you know, it might be the water might feel treacherous and it's bumpy, like feels like turbulence, but it's not going to capsize you in the same way it did maybe the year before. But there's are these waves, and those, the myriad of emotions is quite unique to that person. And knowing that somebody can feel fine 1 minute and then be very angry and then very sad and then seem fine and then it feels like they're in denial, that it isn't linear, but knowing those emotions typically do come up for most people.
Mm-hmm. And in so many different ways. I think for our children too, grief often comes up in different ways. So children grieve very differently from adults. And very often adults will say, I don't understand. It doesn't seem like they're sad at all right after a loss. And what we know about kiddos is that I almost think of it as little spurts. So there'll be spurts of grief. So maybe right afterwards, there's a lot of grief and then we'll see nothing. Suddenly they're playing and they want to go for a play date at their friend's house. And we're going, what is going on with this child? Are they in denial? But we know for children that generally they will grieve over a longer period of time in spurts. So as they hit different developmental phases, as a holiday happens or as a birthday happens, we might see that that grief comes back up. So we may have had a loss that felt like it was a long time ago, and then suddenly at a holiday we see it re-emerge again. So again, just making space that at different ages, stages, different personalities, we all grieve very differently. I find with kiddos, it can be quite helpful to actually just name it too and say, hey, we're coming up to Christmas. And this can be quite hard, particularly because grandpa's not going to be here this year. Let's talk about that.
Absolutely. And I think sometimes our kids surprise us and how they need to cope with it. I'll never forget, like my son, this is going to come up every Christmas as death comes up because we've lost several people since COVID, like in our family, and some relationships have been burned, like with family. And it's just like one of those things where like, it's really hard. And with death in particular, for whatever reason, my son, my youngest, wants to talk about literal death during this time where he wants to revisit how the heart stops beating. And it's quite visceral and it's quite graphic. And it can be like if you want to shut it down, but you also know that's like how he's developing mastery over it, is understanding it. And so when kids surprise you like that, just know this is how they're trying to somehow, you know, conceptualize what's going on, hold on to it. There's a lot of hard questions that come up, like, you know, is there heaven, and are you going to die, and when am I going to die, and will we still be together when this happens? Like lots of these questions seem to resurface every time there's an anniversary in my home, or the holidays come up and then the grief comes up again.
Mm-hmm.
And those are difficult questions, but of course we revisit like our own morals and values and how we want to, but just the preparatory piece of like, how do we want to talk about this rather than being like, we don't talk about this at Christmas and we shut it down. And it's important we make space for that. But I've been shocked at how some of the questions that have come up. And
yeah, I find especially as the little brains, Tammy and I, our kids are the same age, as the little brains are coming more online, the questions are getting more and more interesting. And I find when we go through spurts, when that grief does come up, I personally find it very helpful to read books to my kiddos, just children's books about different characters going through grief, because I find that's one of the best ways to talk to them about grief and loss, so we can talk about the character, and then bigger questions often evolve from that. Yeah. No, honestly, I just go to the library, and our librarians here are fantastic, and I say, can you give me your top 10 children's books on grief? And that's where we get our grief books from.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. My kids like to bake the stories. Like we've read a few, but more or less they like to write books. So they like to make their stories, and that's how it's been cathartic for my younger two, is the pictures and then the story of what happened. And that might have liked that.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think as we talk about kind of family units grieving, I think it's also important as families to talk about, what are we doing with traditions? So what old traditions are we keeping that may have included that person that we've lost? What new traditions do we maybe want to incorporate? And then how are we going to remember the person on Christmas Day or whatever the holiday is? I think talking about those things ahead of time can be really, really helpful, because obviously everybody has very different ideas on how we want to remember the people we may have lost.
Tania, what do you do? I have some interesting ones, but I heard you say that with your brother, like you draw, the kids make like, is it a memory or they draw a picture?
Yeah, they'll draw pictures. The whole family celebrations where we have extended family. At some point in the meal, we'll make a toast and people will recall a memory of my brother. Mm-hmm. But it's changed over time. There were years where it was just awkward, where everybody was, do we mention this? Do we not mention this? How do we actually handle this? So I want to make space for that in families too, where you kind of leave and go, no one said anything because it was just so awkward. And there's been other years where somebody has broken the ice and said, like, hey, I remember when Greg would have, and then there's a conversation around that. Mm-hmm. So it's changed and it's shifted over years. When the girls were little, they were too little to actually do anything with me and Bernard. But Bernard and I always make space and time to remember my brother in some way during the day.
That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. We have a very big Christmas tree in our house. Like, it's massive. And what we've started doing is we've had, loss of people and then loss of animals, because we live on a ranch with like 100 animals, and every year a few animals die. So, and the kids get very attached. So we have ornaments that we order, and then ornaments the kids make that represent people that we've lost or animals that we've lost. And when we decorate the tree, we tell stories about that animal or that person. And it's been very lovely. And even for any of you who have blended families, and this might be hard for some parents, but for my son, we have a picture of his father and I when we were together, our last Christmas together with my son, that he still puts on the tree. Aww. And then we have ornaments of like the two new families, like his dad and stepmom, and there now will be a new little one, and then our blended family at our house. So it's really special to honor that. And those ornaments are so important to him. Like, he puts, like, if we didn't have that out, he would be very, very upset. And I know it might seem counterintuitive, because you're like, you're just going to make them sad, but they need to honor that was life. There's grief there. And it honestly just makes space for that. And it's also saying, like, I honor your relationship with your dad, that your love for him is okay, that I am okay with you loving your stepmom and your little sister there. And I just have found that I couldn't believe how important that is to him now, that he has that before and after ornaments, beautiful. Photo ornaments.
I absolutely love that. In a way, it's his story, right? This is your story. Like, we're proud of your story. We want to celebrate your story. I think too, what something like that does is it opens up conversation, because I think sometimes kids also, do I talk about this? Do I not talk about this with mom and dad? Whereas here we have the ornaments and we can say, oh, here's the ornaments of me and dad, that first Christmas. It creates and promotes conversation instead of, again, the stuffing.
Beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, one of the other traditions that I came across, so we haven't done personally, but that I love, is a memory stocking for somebody. So I know people sometimes do like an empty seat at a table or whatever it might be, but it was a memory stocking that you. So this is again for Christmas that you put up when all the other stockings go up for Christmas, and then as people have memories of that person, they write them down and they put them in the stocking.
Oh, I love that.
Which is
That's,
beautiful.
yeah.
Yeah. Because then again, it opens up that conversation at some point when we actually read the memories.
Yeah, this podcast has been very interesting for me personally. Like we talk about, like I was coming into this being like, oh, we're talking about grief and loss, and like the entire time we're talking about this, being like, oh, this is completely emotional and triggering for me. Like this is particular podcast. So, you and I all have to debrief this after, but
Free
but I
therapy
am,
session.
yeah, but just to any of you listening, like, and this is a hard time of year, like, please know we're with you on this. Like, this is hard. But there is a way through this, and I swear the waves do get smaller, but it's okay to be angry and sad and all of those mixed emotions when the holidays come.
Yeah, 100%. I think just as some final words from me, if I was to give you just something to hold on to, is that you are not alone. Like I mentioned that huge stat at the beginning, you're not alone. There's lots of other people who also struggle through this period. And I think one of the best things that you can do for yourself is to sit down now or sit down before you're coming up to a holiday and just be intentional and go, what do I need? How do I practice self-compassion and self-love right now instead of looking after everybody else?
I love that. I'm going to take that, Tan. I'm going to take that with me today.
Beautiful.
Okay.
Yeah, and then we also have Sam's course.
Yeah, Samantha Dover is a registered psychologist and a grief specialist who works with the Institute. And Sam was my intern at one point, and now she's gone on to do these really amazing things. And she has a really lovely course that she made on helping children with grief and loss. So if you have a child going through that this time of year and you are like, I need more tools, like I'm not sure what to do here, we have the answer. We have a lovely course. I think it's about 3 hours long that can help you with more tools than we could possibly give you in this podcast, and understanding like complex grief and all the different phases of grief and what are the tools and what do I say when. Like that's what this course was designed for.
And we'll put that link in the description so you can just link right through to it. I think that brings us to the end of our podcast today.
Well, everyone, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, whatever holiday you celebrate. And thank you so much for listening to our podcast.
Happy holidays.